Welcome to The Bait. For decades, we viewed Aragorn's hunt for Gollum as, well, basically a literal tracking mission, right? Finding footprints in the mud, piecing together broken twigs, just physically running down a monster.
Yeah, it's usually treated as just a rugged survivalist errand.
Exactly. But what if we've been looking at it entirely wrong? What if those muddy trails in Middle-earth were actually the ultimate clinical case study of a complete internal psychological collapse? And what if the greatest ranger alive completely botched the therapy?
I love that. That is exactly the kind of reframing that makes the upcoming 2026 film, The Lord of the Rings, The Hunt for Gollum, so fascinating to me. We are not just watching a physical body being captured in a physical space.
Right.
We are navigating an absolute labyrinth of a shattered mind. I mean, it is a psychological autopsy.
It really is. And that brings us to the central tension we're exploring today. We are taking this classic fantasy pursuit and mapping it onto the framework of internal family systems, or IFS therapy. In doing so, a profound, albeit theoretical, question emerges. Could Aragorn have actually saved Gollum? Not just captured him, but facilitated a psychological rescue by acting as an external, proxy self, using IFS techniques.
Which is a huge what if.
It is, but I'm coming at this with the perspective that the psychological blueprint for this rescue was sitting right there. I believe that by utilizing what we call self-resonance and intentionally befriending Gollum's extreme protector parts, well, Aragorn could have facilitated a profound moment of psychological unblending.
Right, and I will be taking the opposite stance. I maintain that this kind of clinical optimism completely ignores the harsh systemic realities of this specific narrative.
Okay, lay it out.
I will argue that the One Ring acts as an absolute unattached burden that permanently alters the psychological architecture of the mind. Furthermore, I believe Aragorn's own internal psychological defenses, specifically his deeply ingrained shadow triggers, they structurally and completely prevent such an intervention from ever taking place.
Okay, so let's lay the groundwork for this, because if we map this hunt onto the IFS framework, where the mind is a system of protective parts and wounded exiles, could Aragorn have bypassed the monster to save the hobbit inside?
Right.
When I look at Gollum, I see the ultimate cinematic symbol of a colonized system. But before I get into how Aragorn could have fixed it, can you just walk us through how IFS actually categorizes a mind like this? Like, what are we mechanically looking at when we see Smeagol and Gollum?
Mechanically, IFS understands the human mind, or hobbit mind, I guess, not as a single monolithic identity, but as a complex system made up of a core self and various parts.
Right, we all have parts.
Exactly. And when a system undergoes severe trauma, these parts take on extreme roles to ensure survival. In this case, Smeagol is what we call an exile. Exiles are the parts of us that absorb our deepest vulnerabilities. You know, our traumas, our profound shame.
The softest parts?
Yes. Smeagol carries the memories of kindness, of sunlight, of friendship. But he has been banished deep into the unconscious darkness. Why? Because the core system is far too weak to carry the unbearable guilt of having murdered his friend Déagol for the ring. Smeagol is locked in the basement so the organism can survive.
Right. He is entirely locked away. And when an exile is banished to the basement, somebody has to guard the door. And that is where Gollum comes in.
Precisely.
In IFS terms, Gollum is an extreme firefighter. I find this concept so fascinating because a firefighter part, it doesn't care about your long-term health, your morals, or your social standing.
Not at all.
It only cares about putting out the immediate emotional fire. So Gollum uses aggression, deceit, paranoia, and raw violence to keep Smeagol safe and to protect the precious, because the ring has convinced this system that it's the only thing keeping them alive.
Exactly. The firefighter will burn down the entire house to kill a spider. It's a purely reactive, survival-driven mechanism.
So here's my position.
Gollum's system was completely starved of what IFS calls self-leadership. He had no internal core guiding him anymore.
True.
But in therapy, an external party can step in. If Aragorn had approached this not as a ranger hunting a beast, but had maintained an 8C state, a state characterized by calm, compassion, curiosity, and courage, he could have acted as a proxy self.
A proxy self, right?
He could have literally lent his own nervous system to Gollum. By simply acknowledging and thanking the Gollum part for keeping Sméagol alive in the dark for 500 years, Aragorn could have bypassed that violent firefighter and unlocked the entire system.
Look, I hear the optimism there. I really do. But you're treating Gollum like a standard clinical trauma patient in a sterile modern office.
The mechanics apply.
But that fundamentally misreads the unique physics of this fantasy context. You're proposing a standard IFS intervention, but ignoring the absolute limits of that framework when confronted with this specific mythology. Let's talk about the ring.
Okay, the ring is a factor, obviously.
It's the central factor. In standard therapy, a burden is usually a false belief, right? I am worthless, or I am unlovable, absorbed from a childhood trauma. But the ring is an unattached burden.
Right.
Mechanically, this means it's an external, toxic, alien energy that hasn't just burdened the system, it has actively replaced Gollum's self as a false control center. It's an external sentience masquerading as internal leadership.
Okay, it is a severe burden, absolutely. But let's look at the mechanics of how you actually treat an extreme protector. In IFS, there is a core belief that every part, no matter how monstrous it seems on the surface, has a positive intention.
Sure.
Gollum's intention is survival. There's a specific 3-step intervention Aragorn could have utilized here. The first step is simply recognition. You look at the creature and say, "I see you, Gollum." You separate the entity from the monstrous behavior.
Which, let's be honest, is incredibly difficult when the entity is actively trying to deceive you, bite your fingers off, or lead you into a trap.
Difficult, yes, but not clinically impossible for someone with Aragorn's discipline. But the second step is where the real magic happens. Appreciation. Aragorn says, "Thank you for working so incredibly hard to protect Sméagol."
Oh, wow. Thanking the monster.
When you do that, Gollum is a firefighter who has spent 500 years eating raw fish, hiding in freezing caves, and absorbing the toxic radiation of the ring, all to protect the fragile, weeping kernels of Sméagol's life.
It's a brutal existence.
It is. So when a defensive part hears that its exhausting, deeply isolating labor is actually seen and appreciated, what happens mechanically?
Well, the nervous system actually downregulates. Cortisol drops.
Exactly. The part doesn't have to shout to be heard anymore. It creates a physical space, the nervous system relaxes, and that creates the room for the suppressed exile, Sméagol, to tentatively step forward.
Theoretically.
We know this is possible based on the evidence within the material itself. We see glimmers of Sméagol's self remaining. When he's exposed to old sensory triggers later in the story, the sound of his real name, the taste of cooked food, songs about nature, Sméagol surfaces.
Temporarily, yes.
But the exile steps into the light. Those sensory glimmers absolutely prove that the system is not permanently lost. If Aragorn completes the third step, safety, assuring Gollum that he's there to help him protect Sméagol, the system unlocks.
Okay, that is a beautiful breakdown of the theory, but you are ignoring the wild card reality of this universe. You bring up those glimmers of Sméagol stepping forward. Let's look at what actually happens when those glimmers appear later with Samwise Gamgee.
Well, Sam was...
Any progress you make with a system this deeply colonized is terrifyingly fragile.
It's fragile, certainly. Any trauma recovery is.
It's not just fragile. I maintain that it is completely unsustainable in this environment. Look at the mechanics of the Sam interaction. Sam is a character who also has highly active protective parts. When Sméagol actually starts to show genuine recovery, Sam's own protective suspicion flares up.
Right, his managers take over.
Yes, his manager parts are screaming, "Keep Frodo safe from this monster." And what happens? Sam lashes out verbally. In that exact millisecond, Gollum feels betrayed, the fragile trust shatters, and the system immediately reverts to an extreme firefighter state. He retreats behind the walls.
Yeah, that was a heartbreaking moment.
My point is, the ring manipulates the mind too aggressively for sustained unblending. You cannot maintain an 8C state of calm and compassion in an active war zone, and you certainly cannot out-therapy the active, malicious will of the ring.
See, I don't see it that way. Sam's failure doesn't prove the intervention is inherently impossible. It merely proves that the intervention was interrupted by another unmanaged internal system. Sam couldn't manage his own parts. But let's address your point about the ring's active, malicious will. Isn't this scenario incredibly similar to treating a patient with a severe mind-altering substance addiction?
I wouldn't go that far.
Hear me out. The substance, let's say it's the ring, is an external, unattached burden. It alters brain chemistry. It warps the perception of reality. But in clinical practice, you don't wait for the substance to magically disappear. You still have to bypass the psychological protector parts first to reach the core person who can make the choice to heal.
I have to push back hard there. A chemical substance, no matter how addictive or destructive, does not possess conscious will.
Well, sure.
It doesn't think. The ring does. The ring actively strategizes to destroy the psychological progress you were trying to make.
But the mechanism of treatment remains the same regardless of the burden's sentience. You have to create distance. And IFS has a brilliant tool for this called the internal waiting room.
The waiting room, right.
If the ring is too loud, Aragorn doesn't ask Gollum to disappear or die. That would trigger an immediate panic response. Instead, think of it like putting a car in neutral.
Okay.
Aragorn says to the Gollum part, "You do not have to leave, just step back into the waiting room. Disengage the clutch, keep the engine running, stay vigilant, but let Smeagol steer for 5 minutes to talk to me. If you see me do anything dangerous, you can jump right back in and take over."
A car in neutral. I like that visualization.
Right, and by doing that, Aragorn is asking for just enough temporary distance from the firefighter to allow Smeagol to observe the ring from a distance, rather than be completely consumed by it. He helps Smeagol realize, you are Smeagol. The ring is something else entirely. You are not the burden.
The internal waiting room is an elegant technique, I'll give you that. But it requires the firefighter to trust the external proxy self more than it trusts its own deeply ingrained survival mechanisms.
Which takes time, yes.
And that brings us to the second, and I would argue far more devastating roadblock in your theory. We keep talking about the patient. Let's look at the clinician.
Aragorn.
You are mapping this out as if Aragorn is an objective, detached therapist sitting in a comfortable armchair. We have to shift the focus to the internal architecture of the rescuer himself. Aragorn cannot act as a proxy self because of his own internal burden of duty.
You mean his responsibility to the survival of Middle-earth?
Exactly. Let's break down Aragorn's internal system. He is fundamentally governed by warrior and king manager parts. In IFS, managers are proactive parts that try to keep the system safe by controlling the environment.
Right, they manage the day-to-day survival.
And Aragorn's managers have been programmed by decades of harsh survival in the wild to constantly, relentlessly assess threats. Their primary function is scanning the horizon and asking, is this safe? Is this an enemy?
Sure, he's a ranger.
When you are tasked with the survival of the free world, pausing to offer radical compassion to a hostile, deceitful creature is not just a luxury. To Aragorn's manager parts, it is an active, terrifying danger. It is a fundamental failure of vigilance.
Yes, his manager parts are heavily burdened. But Aragorn isn't only a warrior. He's not a one-dimensional character. He has an immense, deeply rooted capacity for healing. As the lore says, the hands of the king are the hands of a healer.
He does have that capacity, yes, but look at the extreme polarization within him. He's constantly oscillating between justice and compassion. We cannot conveniently forget that Smeagol murdered Déagol. He is a killer.
He was under the influence of the ring, but yes, a killer.
Aragorn's justice-oriented parts are incredibly strong. They demand that evil, or at least the perpetration of harm, be punished or strictly restrained to maintain order. To these justice parts, utilizing IFS to thank Gollum for his violent protective measures feels like dangerously tolerating evil. In a wartime context, The punitive, survival-driven manager parts will almost always overpower the compassionate parts to ensure physical survival.
Wait, let me challenge the mechanics of that. You're treating Aragorn's manager parts as if they are inflexible monoliths that just cannot be reasoned with. Yes, he has a strong warrior part. Yes, he has a demanding justice part. But as you just acknowledged, Aragorn also possesses a profound healer part within his system. Why couldn't Aragorn utilize the IFS technique of self-sampling?
Okay, for those not deep in the clinical weeds, how are you defining self-sampling in this context?
Self-sampling is when an individual intentionally accesses a specific, highly developed part of themselves that naturally possesses the qualities of the core self. In this case, Aragorn's healer part. Aragorn knows he has this capacity.
Right.
When he captures Gollum, instead of letting his harsh ranger parts take the wheel and throw Gollum in chains, he could consciously step back, he could recognize his own anger and impatience, ask those rigid manager parts to soften, and intentionally choose to lead with his healer part. He has the discipline for this. He's not a novice. He possesses an incredibly disciplined, trained mind.
He is exceptionally disciplined. That is not the issue. The issue is that beneath that discipline, he is fundamentally terrified. And this is where the clinical intervention completely structurally falls apart. You are ignoring Aragorn's shadow trigger.
The shadow of his ancestor. The shadow of Isildur.
Precisely. Let's really look at what is required here. To offer true empathy to Gollum, Aragorn has to practice authentic self-resonance. He has to emotionally connect with the exile inside Gollum.
Right, that's the proxy self mechanism.
But doing so requires Aragorn to accept a terrifying psychological reality. If he looks deeply into Gollum's eyes and connects with him, Aragorn has to admit, I too am capable of becoming this exact monster if I stumble.
Hold on, let me synthesize this because that is completely reframing the narrative. You're saying Aragorn isn't just physically disgusted by Gollum, he's looking in a mirror at his own genetic nightmare. It's an internal defense mechanism overriding an external rescue mission.
Yes. Think about it. Aragorn carries the blood of Isildur, the man who actually stood in the fires of Mount Doom, took the ring, and failed. Aragorn has spent his entire life in exile specifically because he is terrified of that exact weakness in his own bloodline.
Wow.
Gollum is not just a target to Aragorn. Gollum is the physical, living manifestation of Aragorn's worst, most deeply buried nightmare about himself.
So Gollum represents Aragorn's own exiled fear.
Absolutely. And because of this, Aragorn's manager parts find Gollum utterly repulsive. It is not just physical disgust at a creature eating raw fish. It is existential terror. In IFS, we know that we often project intense hatred onto others when they display the exact traits we've tried to exile within ourselves.
Right, projection.
It is the hardest thing in the world to extend gratitude to a part, whether in yourself or in someone else, that you actively, violently despise. Aragorn's system is screaming in alarm. He physically cannot unblend from his fear of his own bloodline long enough to see Smeagol clearly.
That is a profound observation about projection and shadow work. I really love that. But I have to say, doesn't that just highlight the tragedy rather than prove the sheer impossibility of it? The mechanics to save Gollum were theoretically sound. The blueprint existed.
A blueprint that was impossible to build.
But if Aragorn could have unblended from his fear of the Isildur legacy, if he could have recognized that his fear of corruption was just a part of him and not his entire core self, he could have accessed that healer energy.
An if is doing an enormous amount of heavy lifting in that sentence. You're asking for a perfect psychological alignment in the middle of a muddy swamp while being hunted by orcs.
Perhaps it's a tall order, but the theoretical path remains valid. If he creates distance from the ring, using the waiting room technique, acts as a proxy self, and speaks directly to the exile, the narrative outcome shifts. And we have to clarify something vital here. In the IFS framework, saving Gollum doesn't mean turning him back into a carefree hobbit who goes back to the Shire to eat second breakfast.
Right, the damage is done.
Exactly.
The ring has done entirely too much physical and neurological damage for a fairy tale ending.
So what does a successful intervention actually look like to you?
Saving him means allowing him to unblend just long enough so that eventually he dies in the state of Smeagol. It means he dies with dignity,
rather than dying entirely consumed by the violent Gollum firefighter. It was a theoretical possibility that was tragically missed because of extreme internal polarization on both sides of the dynamic.
I see the elegance in that theoretical path, I really do, and I appreciate the distinction between a cure and a moment of grace. But I must conclude that the story actually illustrates the absolute boundaries of therapeutic intervention.
Yeah.
There is a point where structural damage is simply too severe. The combination of the ring acting as an overwhelming, sentient, unattached burden, and Aragorn's own necessary survival-driven internal defenses against his ancestral shadow trigger meant that the rescue was structurally impossible from the start. You cannot perform delicate psychological surgery in the middle of an existential war while the patient is actively infected by a sentient poison and the surgeon is triggered by the sight of the disease.
It is a stark, almost clinical way to look at it. But I think where we absolutely converge today is on how utilizing this specific framework completely deepens the narrative. Analyzing this classic fantasy pursuit through the lens of internal parts, exiled trauma, and extreme protective systems transforms what is ostensibly a simple physical hunt in the woods.
Entirely. It is no longer just Aragorn dragging a miserable creature through the mud by a rope. It becomes a profoundly complex tragedy of isolated minds colliding. It is two heavily guarded psychological systems clashing in the dark. They are fundamentally unable to reach the core self of the other because their protectors, whether it is Gollum's violent paranoia or Aragorn's vigilant justice, are simply too heavily armed.
Which brings us right back to where we started. We are not just tracking footprints in the dirt. We are looking at the murky, highly complicated landscape of the psyche. And frankly, it forces us to look inward and ask a rather uncomfortable question about our own internal tracking. We all have these heavily guarded systems. We all have managers that treat our vulnerabilities like active enemies.
And we all have parts of ourselves that we have locked away and exiled in the dark, hoping no one ever sees them.
Exactly. It leaves us to wonder, when we are tracking down our own perceived flaws, our own failures, how long does it take before we finally drop the chains? How long before we step into the internal waiting room and actually extend genuine gratitude toward the darkest, most exiled parts of our own system?